Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Vivek Nemana. He's a colleague friend here in the Department of Sociology at Princeton. So let's just get started broadly about the topics that come to mind. I'm sure you heard about the Modi government's decision to repeal the farm bill, the farm law.
The farm laws, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So do you have any take on that, and what's the sort of motivation that he's taking in?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I haven't read that much. I only read a couple of articles about it, but I have been following the farm bill protests quite extensively, and there's a lot of interesting things that immediately come up, right? So just to review, the farm bill, the bills, the controversial bills, basically what they did is they repealed the minimum support price system that had long been in place. It's kind of, the whole system was a little bit convoluted, but basically, farmers, there were these government run markets where all farmers had to sell wheat at a certain price, and it was a guaranteed price, and it was a guaranteed market for them. And so if they had like a crop, then they would go sell it. And the thing is, that was the only place in which where farmers could sell it, right? So the government had a monopoly on that, and then the government would then redistribute the wheat in various ways, selling it to the private sector, putting it in national strategic reserves, and all that. So what the government did is the laws, they said you no longer had to only sell at the government markets. You could sell it privately to private vendors. And it was interesting because it was sold in this very neoliberal fashion as something you're giving actually farmers more choice and more freedom. They're not forced to sell it to one buyer anymore. They can find a buyer who sells it higher and sells it elsewhere. And this is where it gets really interesting. So why would farmers be opposed to something where, in theory, because
they could be making more money.
They could be making because the laws didn't say that those government markets would be removed. Just simply that farmers could also sell it outside to private sector. So it was a lot of Western business papers were very supportive of this, saying this is actually the kind of reforms we need. You're giving farmers freedom to sell at higher prices, but farmers and farming remains the biggest livelihood in India, supporting something like 400 million people or something like crazy like that. And that includes not just farmers, but all these people who work on farms. There's this whole like network around of like other occupations that are around agricultural livelihoods, right? So it was so widely condemned and widely opposed. And it's one of the largest protests the world has ever seen that has been running until to this day. It started in like last year. So it's been over a year, I think, where they've been going on. So why would farmers be opposed to something that in theory gives them actually the freedom to sell it at a higher price? Well, they said, well, we know what's going to happen the moment you start running this. The government markets already don't work. So the moment you open it up to the private sector, like those markets will no longer have anyone working for them anymore. Like the government will stop staffing people to work there. So basically
the only buyer will be the private.
The only buyer will be the private sector, which is not bound by an upper limit, but also not bound by any lower limit on what the price is. So that private sectors now would be coming in, they wouldn't have the government to compete with them, and they will drive the price down lower and lower and lower. And what makes them think this is simply experience in India, right? Like this is how private sector buyers, especially large private sector buyers, have always worked. They've driven down the price.
So the farmers, they might have been okay with the law if there was a minimum support price that's guaranteed even in the private market.
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I don't know in detail what they would have been okay with, because the farmers had unions that were negotiating, so they clearly had terms that they were and weren't in favor of. But I think, yeah, I think basically what the farmers were saying is only having this system in which the state is the sole buyer of wheat is the only thing that will allow farmers to remain afloat. Like we don't we're okay with not having a higher price in which we can sell it because the main thing is like, well, what is keeping the price from going down any lower, right? So I guess, yeah, if the private sector players had to have a minimum price too, I don't know, would it have been as controversial? I don't know. I maybe not, but I kind of think that then these reforms wouldn't have been passed that way in the first place, right? The point of the reforms was to sort of expand commercial agriculture in India, and this is one of those things in India that has not really been scaled fully yet. There's lots of reasons for that. There has been land reforms in modern Indian history that limited the size farms can be, but in India, farming is something that is actually done at a small scale. It's very unlike American agriculture. But for a long time, the government has actually wanted to import the American model of agriculture, in which you have these big farm tools and these huge farms that can be done at very cheaply by super rich farmers, right? But the thing is that fundamentally goes at odds with like what farming actually represents in India, which is a source of food for just a vast population, and it only works because there are lots of small farmers.
Yeah, well, so I just checked the numbers earlier this morning when I read the article in the New York Times, and something like 40+% of the Indian population is still employed in agriculture. But it used to be over 60% even back in the 1990s.
Yeah.
So there's a substantial decline of agricultural employment, and you have fewer and fewer people working in that sector.
Right.
But they still have, you could say, an emotional but also an economic stake in keeping things the same, right? Or keeping the support of government minimum prices.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I've thought about farming in India for a long time now, because it's like I mean, in all those things, the emotional, the sort of body politic aspect of farming, they've also changed. So yeah, farming has had a huge outmigration, which has actually been very aggressively encouraged by the government. So in these places in rural India where I do field work, that's one of many examples in which the government goes in and tells farmers, don't make sure your kids leave farming. Send them off to school, send them to the cities. We don't care what they do in the cities, but just stop farming, because this is not what a modern country does. Farming represents. So farming used to have this politically very symbolically important role, in the sort of overall narratives of Indian politics, where it was always about farmers were the sort of like the ideal hardworking, struggling Indian citizens, right? They were the ones feeding the country. They were the ones for whom the country should support and appreciate in return. So, kind of politicians would always run on trying to get the farmer vote, and then it's also the fact that so many people are farmers is a really important aspect of it. But so that's things like every political rally you see things like, okay, loan forgiveness for farmers or free power for farmers. So there's all these experiments that were not maybe economically very smart, but politically they were very popular things. And I think what you've seen recently in the last 20 years or so is this, and actually Lily Irani has this really interesting book called Chasing Innovation, and it's like this change of this move away from the ideal political subject, right? Who used to be the Indian farmer, the one for whom the state should, that's why the state exists. That's who we're trying to save, to someone who's more of an innovator or a global business person and all that. The one who goes abroad, goes out, leaves the country, makes India look good and developed on the international stage, proves to the world that, Indians can also do commerce and global trade on the same level as the West. So that's a very important, I think, very powerful shift that, I think that is caused by a lot of different things, but also has consequences that affect how politics are seen and understood, how it's read by the middle class and everything. So Yeah, I think with the farmers' protest, it's interesting because I think you saw this huge like polarization in terms of response to what the protests were doing. So there was a time in which the middle class, the Indian middle class, the educated urban middle class, was very like pro farmer, right? Their politics were very much in favor, at least rhetorically, if not actually in practice, but rhetorically in supporting the needs of farmers. But with the protests, you saw actually the same educated middle class. They're being like, why are farmers standing in the way of development and stopping development? We need this. The country needs this.
So the
And
desire of the middle class is to pay less money for food,
it,
and
it,
one way to do that is to have the competition in the private corporate sector in agriculture.
yeah, I mean, I think the desire for the middle class is to just have, greater foreign investment, like larger, more efficient markets, like all these things that we associate with a certain kind of market-oriented development, right? Um, and they are less concerned about the people who will be displaced by those things. So there's a basic question here of if we have American farming in India, America now only 2% of the population is farmers, right? America used to be a country of farmers, but that's completely changed. What people did here was they went from farming. The industrial revolution happened. They joined factories. They became a working class. They became a modern industrialized working class, and now we've like gradually went on to the service sector, right?
And the few farming jobs that we still have, we let the Mexicans, the immigrants, to do that.
Right,
It's not going
right.
to be, the you could say native white stock that does any of that.
Yeah, or the native white stock, they operate the John Deeres, the big tractors, they do the capital, the heavy capital end of it, or they own the farms. But the jobs that are that can't be that you can't automate your way around, that require basic human labor, like picking apples from the trees or something like that's done by immigrants here. Yeah, in India, it's not it's still like very much a country of small farmers, right? Farming is a small scale thing. There have been other changes that have really affected and like kind of harmed farmers, like the introduction of genetically modified seeds. I mean, like that's a whole different discussion, but that's one of those things where genetically modified agriculture makes more sense with westernized, at scale, technologically advanced farming, right? It's not something that necessarily makes sense to the small 1 acre farmer. But what we've seen is, the total domination of cotton markets, like where native seeds have been replaced by Monsanto seeds, and that has squeezed like the low capital farmers and benefited the higher capital ones. Um, where was I going with this? The politics. Yeah, the politics. Yeah. So one of the other major things. I mean, my research has a lot to do with this. Is the outward migration. The children of farmers are no longer returning to farming. There's lots of reasons for that. Educational expansion has been a major thing. So people go away. You go to school. Schooling is like not actually compatible. The way we do education, it's not compatible with this life of you have to get up in the morning, work on the fields. What you learn about the fields, that is a form of education, right?
Yeah, I was very struck by the figures that you cited on the number of higher education institutions from your talk.
Mm-hmm.
And could you give the listeners a little sense of the magnitude of the expansion of higher education in India?
Yeah. So okay, like you said, last 30 years, farming went from something 60% of the workforce to 40%. You take a country with 1.3 billion people, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people, right, have left. So it's like, where did they all go? And I think the real question is like, they didn't stop being farmers. It was that their children stopped taking up and returning to the land. Farming is something that is very much ancestral. You have this family piece of land. Your father's worked on it, your grandfather's worked on it, now you're working on it. You've learned from them how to do it. So it's like their children have left farming, and in the same period, for instance, India went from having what is the exact number? 10,000 universities in 2000 to about 40,000 in 2020. So the number of universities and colleges in India has quadrupled in just 20 years. And that also coincides with the number of people who are enrolled in college. So now uh, gross enrollment rates for tertiary education, that is, the percent of people who are college aged who are actually in college, is 30% in India, which is insane considering that not that long ago, you didn't have 30% of people going to secondary school, going to high school, right? I mean, it was not even, it's only, we're talking about, less than a lifetime, maybe 60 years ago, when you didn't have 30% of school age children going to primary school.
Right, so there's this idea of leapfrogging, technologies that's usually used in a developing country context where you don't have to go from nothing to the landline to the cell phone, but you can go straight from nothing to the cell phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be what's happening in higher education in India as
Yeah.
well, right?
Yeah, no, I think that I haven't thought about it that way, but I think that is a phenomenal way to put it, Larry. Like, I think it is like that's like the thing. So like before, when I was working as a freelance journalist, I was in really these rural Indian towns, and part of the reason why I came to do a sociology PhD was I was seeing these villages in which they were very remote villages, like they were truly agrarian places, in which the whole culture, the whole history of the town was like the rhythms of life were around the agricultural cycle. That's when the festivals would be. That's when how people work together and cooperate. It was all about supporting like this process of growing your own food, right? Um, the way the villages are built are all around this, it's about supporting agriculture and all that. So in these places that have just been historically, they only make sense when you think of them as a place in which most people are farmers. In one generation, you had, these very, very poor farmers who had not gone to school. Now their children were not just going to school; they were not just going to high school. They were going off. They were going to the towns, and they were getting, some kind of higher education. It wasn't very good quality. That's the thing. It's like never, the children of these farmers, they're not going to like the best schools, but they're going to higher. They're studying after 10th grade, after 12th grade, getting bachelor's degrees, which again, all they later realized aren't worth what they thought they would be. But that was part of the problem, right? It's the fact that when you are leapfrogging education, your parents can barely read, and now you're going to college, like you assume that must be like you must be doing amazing progress, right? Because you absolutely are. It's like you're not even the child of high school graduates. You're the child of fourth grade dropouts, and you're going to college. And yeah, that's been this major social change in which how people are coming, the identity they have as they're coming of age in India, that has radically changed.
Right. So, and any young person that goes through higher education, uh, would not want to go back to farming. I mean, it would tell their farming parents, what you're doing is absolutely, primitive or from yesterday. I, never want to make my hands dirty, and I'm entitled to good-paying jobs in the service industries, in accounting, finance, and all these jobs, informatic technology. But it seems to be like what you are arguing from the labor market data that is at our disposal, that those promises to upward social mobility in the labor market for those higher educated people is not happening, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I've seen so far, and I guess I should be cautious about this because I haven't I think this is all before actually having gone to India and formally doing all this stuff as like a social scientist. But I was asking these questions when I was there as a journalist too. Um, yeah, I think it's what I find interesting here is this conflict between this cultural idea of upward mobility, which you describe as, the children of farmers going to college and saying, why would I want to farm? And the actual reality of what that process of upward mobility, specifically the education aspect that is like crucial or considered to be like a prerequisite for any of that upward mobility, what it actually means, right? I'm so sorry. So when I was there in Arcot Valley, I was there for a couple of years before grad school, and I would go to all these farming villages, and what I liked to do was ask the parents and then their children, parents who are farmers, and then their children, just about what the parents expected of their kids, what they would hope they would do, and what the children would expect and what they wanted to do, right? And it was always as clear. There was like two clear patterns. One is you notice it as soon as you go there. You look at the fields. It's all old people. It's like older bodies. It's people who maybe are farming. Like there's no young people working on the fields. There are still people there, but they're all maybe in their 40s, maybe getting older, getting to an age where maybe they shouldn't be doing it as much anymore. But there's just no stock of youth who has replaced them. Whereas in the past, it's like like their children would be, they would come of age and they would start doing it. That's gone. That process has. So that was like something that's so crucial for the reproduction of agrarian practices in India that has like kind of disappeared. They can hire labor. There's like some kind of migrant labor markets and all these other things, but that's only a part that's very different, right?
But the migrant laborers themselves might be high in age, right?
Right, exactly. The migrant laborers themselves might be high in age,
Yeah.
and it's also disrupted the sort of reciprocal nature of helping of farming. So, if you have a farm and I have a farm and we're neighbors, I help you, you help me. It's even, right? But when that kind of like common ownership of farming is no longer there, then it's like, how do we deal? We can't help each other out. It's like you have to pay me or I have to pay you. There's new sort of financial practices now around how we help each other, which makes farming more expensive. I mean, farming has, and that's also been a factor here. Is farming is getting more capital intensive, so you need more money to do it, and it's getting more riskier because climate change means the monsoon is not as predictable anymore. So that's a huge factor in all of this. Is most of these farms are monsoon fed, and the monsoon used to be very timely. But if the window at which the monsoon comes has expanded, and it's clearly expanded to like many more months.
So more months of rain, essentially.
Not more months of rain, but like a larger interval at which the monsoon can start, right? So let's forget about the heaviness of the rain, and that's actually getting that's a problem too. Is like when either the monsoon might not come anymore, or when it does come, it can be very intense and too intense.
I see.
But like even holding that steady, let's say, so if the monsoon would always come between July and August, like so then you knew, and you can look at like, for instance, there's seed festivals that a lot of rural places have, where it's like they worship the goddess, and it's like that's the time in which everyone buys and plants seeds.
So you have to adjust the timing of planting the seeds.
Yes.
Based on the beginning of the monsoon
Because
season.
you have to plant it just so that they are germinating at the time when which the monsoon will come, and it'll be good, right? If you plant it too soon, they will germinate too soon and they will die. If you plant it too late, then they get washed away by the monsoon, or they can't actually benefit from the rains. So
what's the ideal time period? Like 1 month before the rain
I don't know. I think it depends on the crop, but like but you can see how deeply embedded these things are by like So in Arku there is this thing. It's called the Mordicum festival, and it's a seed festival, right? It's like when everyone buys the seeds and then they plant it. They still practice this festival, but it's like kind of a ghost festival now, because for one thing, the children aren't farming anymore, so that hasn't been reproduced, right? So there isn't like the kind of life that it would have had otherwise. And also the second thing is that, it's time for it is time to this this period in which the monsoon would always come between July and August, right? But now the monsoon can come in May, it can come in September, it can come in like any other time. It can come like much later. So you can't actually like use that festival as like the right time to plant your seeds. People do start planting then, but it's just a bigger risk, right? Because you don't actually know when it's going to come, which means that you're much more likely to have a failed crop now. So all of these are reasons in which young people cite when they say,
Just making farming less desirable.
yeah, why would I want to go farm? I don't like. There's no money in it. There's nothing, and it's also not. It's like the way in which you make money in farming is very. You get one big pay, you get a few big paydays, right, when you sell all your crops. But other than that, you're kind of not. You don't have a steady stream of income, and it's like that's actually incompatible with the kind of lifestyle that people want to live. You want to have a consumerist lifestyle. That you got to have money coming in so that you can. There's all these ways in which farming is seen as backwards, as young people interpret farming as backwards, as insufficient, as also once you're a farmer, you can only be a farmer. There's no envisioning what else you can do growing from that, But you go in and you can get a job in a factory, you can do so many other things. You get a government job, you can do so many other things, right? You can at least imagine this trajectory of growth. There's a possible narrative
Right,
there.
the upward social mobility again goes back to higher education, where it's only by going to college that you get these desire to move upwards.
To move upwards and to do something, right? Or you can get it. I mean, the thing that everybody wants is a government job. That's the idea. But a government job does that, right? You need to have a minimum level of education. There are quotas that are very nicely. There are. The thing that most people would study for in these places is to be a teacher. And I can tell you some numbers. So, public school teachers in this tribal area, there's a rule saying only tribal graduates can be hired as public school teachers. In these tribal schools everywhere, and there's lots of tribal schools, and there are lots of public school teachers who are tribal now, right? And public school teachers as government employees, they make 50,000 rupees a month, which means that they are rich. They are by village standards there, because a farmer can expect to make about 5,000 rupees, maybe 10,000, at most 10,000 with all the other income sources. So the school teacher is making a lot of money, and it's regular money. It's 50,000 rupees a month guaranteed. And once you have that job, you don't have to be, you can be good or bad, but you're gonna get that job. So you see teachers in these villages, people actually successfully becoming teachers. They were the children of farmers themselves. They went to college. They got their education degrees. They got hired as teachers. They benefited from the quota, and now they are amassing.
And they tell all the childhood friends, hey, look at what I did with myself.
Because he's the same as you, right? But but he's done it, or she's done it, and yeah, and they are making they are making so much money, and they're also able. They do other things, they're now able to have enough money to where they're going to buy up the other farms. They're going to buy up more land. They're going to build they're going to build a bigger house. They're going to get their relatives jobs, because sometimes you need to bribe people to get a government job, and they have the money to do that. I mean, all these things. But the thing is, again, so many things today, there is the vision of success. There you see people doing it. It feels very close to you, because it's probably someone from your own village, someone you knew growing up, who became a teacher, right? But then, not long after, you have the situation in which all these children of farmers, they leave farming, they go to school, they're encouraged by the government, they're given loans, they're told to go. They have these free colleges where they can go and pursue education degrees. They study, and they study to become teachers, and this is where the problem begins. Now it's not just the fact that you have too many people who have studied to be teachers, but the rules of the bureaucracy get much like nastier, you know. At a time like 10 years ago, maybe like 10 years prior, when you were just going into this education route yourself, you know, there weren't that many educated tribal youth, right? So there weren't that many people becoming teachers. So it was like the system worked for them, because for the few people who made it, right? But now it turns out like the system is no longer that system anymore, because there might be a rule saying you have to get a certain score on this test, and then you will be hired. The government is supposed to has to hire you as a teacher, but there are just delays. Like there are court cases. There are like even though there is like that's the mandate, the government doesn't actually hire that many teachers specifically because it turns out there's too many. It underestimated the number of people it was going to get, and there's actually a lot more people. Or it hires teachers on a
There's
not
a
on
lot
a
of applicants in teaching schools.
there's a lot of applicants in teaching schools, but there's also they are realizing that the rules of the game are not actually the rules that were told to them. You know, they're applicants in teaching schools where they go up and they study hard, and they have one goal, which is I have to score. There's a teaching entrance test, and I have to get a certain amount of marks on that test. And once I do, then I will have the job as a teacher. So they prepare their whole life doing that, and they get it, and they make it. They pass, they get that score. But then it turns out that actually so then they'll get a thing where they'll get a promise from the government saying, "Oh yeah, okay, you will get hired when we do the next round of hiring." And the next round will never comes, even though it's supposed to happen every year. There's all these different delays, and these the reality of it ends up being much worse, right? So they're in this new category which never existed before. They are unemployed. They're looking. The word that you use in Telugu is kaliga unnanu, which means It can mean I'm doing nothing, or I'm also empty. You know, I'm without something, right? That's not something a farmer would ever say, because a farmer is never empty. A farmer always has work to do and always things to do, right? But even now, if you are an educated, unemployed person, you're the child of a farmer, you have envision your future as this trajectory. You've done that, but now you're in this moment of waithood where you're not actually getting the jobs. It turns out nothing you apply for is available. Anything else, the other things, there are other options much more informed, temporary contracts and stuff like that. But that actually pays just a fraction of it, right? So you don't know if you want to go into that or not. You're thinking maybe I can wait it out and try. But then now you think of yourself as unemployed. Even if you're helping your father on the farm.
Yeah, I saw a study by, I want to say his name was Chafee, but it was about the Song Dynasty in China. There was the dynasty in the past. And they faced a very similar problem. So the Chinese system, the highest rank that you could get is a reputation is inside the state bureaucracy, where you have to pass an entrance exam. And unfortunately, the government was having economic problems. Essentially, they couldn't raise enough tax revenues. Maybe the productivity in the farms was going down, or there was war, or bad harvest and things like that. So they had to do austerity in the civil service, right? Which means that you were having fewer new entrants into the civil service, but you still had all these people that were applying and studying to pass the exam. And the end result of it, well, there's different things. I mean, so part of the you'd say crop of applicants that come from really poor families, because they have to drop out and they have to go back to the farm.
Notice that in India too. It's the poorest
right
people. The kids who didn't even have the option to go to education, they'll become farmers.
Right, and then the ones that somewhat more affluent, or at least had enough money to sustain that applicant financially, they could basically be retaking the exams into the 40s and 50s, and
Yeah, they keep trying.
they could really be, middle-aged to older people at that point, uh, without giving up the dream to, bring pride to the family and become a civil servant.
Yeah, it's that's funny because it's like in our Valley, and I think this is actually the system, the pattern at a lot of places in India, and it seems like in China and I think other countries too. That's what I would notice too. So, I would meet three kinds of young people in our Valley, right? One is the type who they're very, very financially insecure. Maybe they were orphaned, they were adopted. They don't have anyone to marshal these resources for them to invest in their education. So they'll go to like the free school, they'll go to like until fifth grade. Maybe they go until eighth grade and they drop out. But then they're like, okay, I know what I'm going to do is I'm not going to spend my time trying to study. I'm going to go I'm gonna go take a job. Like I'm gonna continue the farming thing because that's real, that's something that can be done every single day. That is guaranteed, even if it's not. The thing that it's not is it has the least amount of cultural cachet. It's like, the least desirable thing is seen as like the least, but it's there, and it's like I think people who are in that position, you can't really be like, you don't that cultural thing isn't really a choice, right? It's like this is what the reality that you're facing. And then the second type of person I would see is people who have, maybe they'd graduated to high school, they have a little more money, but they might have done some college, but they have fallen on some kind of family hardship, let's say, like where maybe they lose a parent or somebody in the family gets sick or something, but like this now, they had aspirations to join, the working world or, get a job, but that's like kind of gone away, like they can't wait forever for that anymore. So they go into these like informal sector roles, right? They drive rickshaws, they work for a shop, they do small forms of enterprise. So you're not farming anymore, you've left that, but you're in this large informal median economy, right? Where it's not, there's nothing guaranteed. It's like it doesn't pay that well. It doesn't pay that much more than farming, but it's something in which money.
But there's a lot of demand for these positions.
There's demand for these positions, and money is constantly circulating, right? And you're not a farmer. You're actually you're not your parents anymore, right? You're not doing that thing. You are much more in tune with like the outside world, right? Because a rickshaw driver is actually he's not like. He's not
could
rural
be meeting
as
Western tourists,
right, or like yeah, or I mean, you're it's like the cultural thing I think really matters there, where it's like the farmer who's seen as like the farmer doesn't know anything of the outside world. That what reminds you of this like, the sort of like real like underdevelopment. But you can be like someone who's like who's working in transportation, for instance. You're still kind of like going around India and all that, and there's like there's money there, but then it's the people who are relatively better off in these villages, who have families. Maybe they have a family member who actually works for the government or something. Families who come from families who can kind of continue to marshal these resources, where they're the ones who are, I think, most intent on kind of joining the middle class, getting a proper government job. Doing what they can, like they're the hungriest to do it, and they will wait the longest, right? And I don't know, this is like one of the things I want to go investigate more when I go to India. But it's almost like this resource curse in this way, in which by having like enough resources where in your relative field you're actually better off, and you can wait it out longer, you're almost at more of a disadvantage because you are more likely to reach for the thing that you'll never actually get.
Right. I mean, even in the Western countries, I mean, we know that labor markets have become, we could say, less stable. It's harder to get upwardly social mobile, and companies take advantage of it through unpaid internships.
Right.
Right, and then the thing is, well, who gets to do unpaid internships? I mean, I know I come from working class families. So I mean, I knew that this wasn't in the cards for me. I could never do that kind of thing. But I knew certainly like middle class people who, could basically ask their parents to, find them a flat in the city that they would do their 2 months of summer internship
Right.
and whatever the food that they need.
And it adds so much to the cost of education, right? You're now spending the summers too, not, supporting yourself in the city or something, not making any money, and yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, for the middle class people, you don't need that, right? I mean, you can just invest your time in, sort of filling up your resume and signaling to potential employers that
Yeah.
you're, you know, that you're a good worker and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
right. It's
But that's where the class divide is sort of
yeah.
coming into play, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's funny because I think it's like with these processes of like this like modern global capitalism, like globalization, all this moment that we're in. I think that's something we are. I'm sure people have written about this, but it's like all these new forms of class fissures are emerging, right? Uh, I mean, I think you see this in rural areas all the time. I saw it in Wisconsin too, and you see it, in this Wisconsin. There was these towns where there were dairy towns where they were talked about. There used to be everybody in town would have a 40 cow farm. Now there have been much more radical divides where you have some families who have now bought up all the farms. They're massive farmers. They're rich business people or they're rich professionals, and a lot of others who have like fallen back, who have lost even the stability of a small farm. Um, I think in India, what you see is yeah, like you know, in these 15, 20 years ago, like what generation ago, these relatively egalitarian tribal villages where, to be fair, they were egalitarian in the sense that everybody was super poor, right? But these relatively small
But the
differences
little you had, you shared with
you
others.
you shared, or it's like yeah, and
Yeah.
there weren't like, and there would be small differences, but they would kind of maybe go like they would even out over time where they weren't that profound. Maybe it would be like someone is like it's like you have like the village head, so they have like some more land and all that, but it stays in the village, those differences have been like the basis of much more deepening fissures, right? It's like now it changes like what paths their children take altogether, and
Basically, what market value do you have?
yeah,
Essentially,
yeah, I mean
and
it's like
that's very different for
right,
different
right.
occupations.
It's
And,
like yeah, exactly. It's like the difference that you're saying about between like middle class, like unpaid internship takers, and
yeah.
yeah.
So let's turn to another point in your project. It seems to me that you wanted to focus on elite level discourse,
Hmm.
and because it it's the elites, the government officials, maybe the corporate leaders, the media representatives, who promulgate the narrative that there's a skills shortage.
Hmm.
We don't have enough, skilled workers to do the necessary jobs for the 21st century Indian economy. Um, yeah, so talk a little bit about that elite narrative and perhaps some of the reasons why they would take on this narrative.
Yeah. So I guess my interest in the elite, and I didn't really explain this in the presentation the other day, but I think my interest in the elite narrative comes from like seeing, okay, there's like two things that in a kind of developing country, like the project of economic development, there's two things that are kind of happening right at any time. One is you have these changing conditions on the ground and people who are adapting to all this social economic change, right? Like children of farmers now deciding they want to go into education and so on. Changes in how people pay for it, changes in how they live. These are real changes on the ground. But then you have the discursive aspect of it in terms of usually set by elites and global global, like international organizations in terms of what development ought to look like. What does it mean? What should be done? And it's highly moralistic always, right? There's a strong sense of what is good and what is bad. Let's take a step back from the skills shortage and like look at just what's said about farming. Like farming, it's like not there's nothing fundamentally bad about farming. Yes, it's low productivity and slow money, but those are things that can be changed about farming, right? But this thing of don't be a farmer, go to education instead. That's a moral argument or a moral claim, kind of what is good, what kinds of like ambitions and life paths are good, and what types are undesirable, and what is like the right thing that parents should be doing to their kids. So this whole thing about education, sending your kids to school, I mean, I yes, education is really, really important, right? But the idea that it's like a good, important thing, that's what parents who really love their kids, what they do is send them to education. That has to come from somewhere, right? That idea. And it's like a local idea and it's like something that everyone shares, but it's also very much driven by elites. It's these elites who are coming in the first place and saying, tell your kids to stop farming. Let's send them to. And you can see all these ways in which it does serve elite interests. For instance, this tribal area was the site of left wing left wing insurgency for a long time, and schools were built all around tribal areas in India at this time of left wing insurgency, which also coincided with the discovery of all these like valuable minerals that people wanted to mine, and they had to get people off their land. So if people stop farming, that's a good way of getting them off their land. If you can get them to sell their land, even better, because now your land has been capitalized, like this land that's always been held.
Yeah.
And also getting their children. So like these schools were built basically away from these villages. They're designed clearly as places that can be like second as like police bases for police can use. But there are also ways of pulling young people away from the farm and putting them in these schools that were residential, where they would go and they would learn. And I don't know at what level this is like intentional or not, but it's clear what happened is they would go there and then they would be far away from the village. They would not learn the farm, all these like all the know-how of how to be farming because they were there all the time. And they would come back and decide that they no longer wanted to be farmers, that they wanted to do something else, right? So it was the same elite. So it was the very elites who had pushed education so much that it totally changed the fabric of Indian society. Now it's they're responding. Okay, so what happened after doing that for a generation? Turns out you have a lot of educated young people in India who have nothing to do, who don't have jobs.
Right. So they're not going back to the farms.
They're not going back to the farms.
But then, you might become a rickshaw driver, but you say, oh yeah, I do this temporarily just to pay the bills, I guess.
Yeah, or you decide that's what you are now. You're a rickshaw driver now, right? But it's like there's all sorts of there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of doubt, and also it's like those are not formalized positions, right? It's like India has. So you join the informal economy, which employs 93%. 93% of the entire Indian workforce is in the informal economy. And the informal economy has only grown, like in percentage-wise over time. So globalization has also coincided not with this like rationalization of the Indian economy as Weber predicted, but a growing informalization of it too. So you have right now, I was interested in this, like in the last 10 years, basically, you have this new elite narrative that emerged in India, which is that we have a massive skills shortage where we have a large number of Indian youth who 15 years ago, they're saying, we're educating them all now, so guess what's going to happen? They're going to leave behind their primitive ways, like farming, whatever, handloom, weaving, whatever crafts. They're going to go to school. They're going to be fluent in the grammar of global capital, and they're going to be able to join the productive workforce and give the country a demographic dividend. It's going to be when they start working, it's going to be India is going to be supercharged and become like they wanted, ambitions of becoming the next superpower, right?
And magically, the new industries are going to come back in
And then
employ these people.
and all these new industries will come, and yeah, they're going to employ them because they'll be like it'll because it's also on this assumption that work and labor is so mobile now, where industries will just set up wherever they can find the cheapest workforce. And guess what? We have this educated, school educated workforce, and they're a lot cheaper than what you'd get in the U.S. or in probably in China at this point and all that. So we can do whatever the world needs in terms of labor. You can do that in India. That was the hope.
Now, just to be clear, I mean, those industries do exist. So, I mean, if I call up Verizon and there's a gentleman from, India, I guess whether in Hyderabad or Bangalore,
Yeah.
who's going to pick up that phone and going to address my customer complaint or concerns. So, those kinds of, service sector jobs from the West, they do exist.
Yeah, they do exist.
But it's not a lot of jobs.
No, I mean, the West doesn't need 100 million call center employees. All these companies together, they don't need 100 million call center. They need only a few. It's the thing is, these industries, the way they've actually worked out is what they didn't have, I think, what it didn't plan for is the role that automation plays, right, in all of this. I mean, that's one of the many things, but that's one of, it's like, these are where growth has occurred in India has been in this high productivity jobs like IT and finance, where you don't need that many people, actually. You only need some people. So those jobs do pay well, right? Relatively. I mean, they've gotten lower and worse paying too, because there's been an overproduction of engineers and stuff. But yeah.
But overall, high productivity, relatively high wages compared to farming and other sectors of the economy, but low employment.
But low employment. So those jobs could hire the children of upper caste, middle class, like government workers, right? So my family is a good example of someone who's benefited from that turn. So my grandparents' generation, they were all government employees, and my parents' generation too, the ones who stayed in India, they were government employees. So they were very well positioned. They were upper caste. They had moved to the cities. So my cousin's generation, they all became, they grew up in, middle class government salary households, but they were able to go to school, and they were able to go to good schools and go into engineering and get jobs at places like IBM or whatever, or they were able to, migrate to the US and all this stuff. So that version of growth to globalization really worked out for them, because they were able to
people who had high social capital.
People who had high social cultural capital, yes, they were able to successfully become engineers. The children of poor farmers couldn't compete with that. I mean, how can you? You don't grow up speaking English, right? You don't grow up doing all these things that it turns out you need to do to get those jobs. And there aren't that many jobs in the first place. There's only enough to hire these kids who are already in the city. There's not enough to hire all the kids who have come from who have left farming, the hundreds of millions of others who have, want to go into this job market where you learn something in school and then you go and try to do it in the world. So that's a major shortcoming. We're now, so this stuff on the skills crisis in India comes this elite panic over, why are our young people unable to find jobs? It comes as a response to this, where turns out you no longer have just educated urbanites anymore who can do your call center jobs. You have all these other educated people who aren't really good for the call center jobs, but at the same time, they in another world they could have gone into manufacturing, that's the traditional path. The
Mhm.
country,
Yeah.
but we don't live in that world anymore, where countries develop
Right,
because
that's Roderick's premature
that's
deindustrialization concept.
premature
Yeah.
deindustrialization.
Do you want to explain this a little bit to the listeners?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
that's about?
So premature deindustrialization is like this trend. Danny Roderick has talked about it. A lot of other economists have talked about it, where and now it's become, I think, it's a very mainstream idea now. I think in econ, where traditionally we think of countries developing as they go from an agricultural economy to one that's manufacturing. So you have a huge workforce that's like in manufacturing, working in factories, and then they move on to the service sector, right? So the U.S. is a good example where we had the Industrial Revolution. We had all these farmers who had left, who joined the factories, and eventually their grandchildren, over generations, manufacturing kind of declines, but it's okay because you had this developed middle class that is like well poised to move into these like high end services or other services, right? And obviously, even in the U.S., we really struggle with this like with deindustrialization and what it means. So in countries like India and in Africa now, it turns out you don't even have a manufacturing stage anymore. You go directly from this agrarian pre-industrial society to one in which you just have this fast growth in services, and no development of a large manufacturing base. So that happened in India. In India, the manufacturing base actually like shrank since liberalization in 1992, and that's because the state used to do import substitution and had all these state-run industries that hired a lot of factory workers, and those have all been either privatized or shut down, or we just import those things now.
And I mean, the complication of premature deindustrialization is that you still need to have a sizable manufacturing sector. I mean, both in terms of employment, but also in terms of output.
Mm-hmm.
Because employment you need because of the middle class wages and the consumption economy that it would support, and then of course the productivity because you can export manufactured goods at very high markup in the global economy, which is the reason why you could have like Western countries like Germany or Japan that are rich essentially. I mean, because they still have manufacturing output as sort of the core aspect of the economic model.
Yeah, or take a more recent example is East Asia. East
In
Asia,
China,
yeah. I mean, China, Taiwan, like all these Asian tiger countries did successful. Korea is 98% urban, right? But I mean, not long. I mean, it was in the 20th century when Korea was still a rural place, but Korea successfully built a large high-tech manufacturing industry that was able to employ all these people. But that happened at a particular historical moment where
automation wasn't as advanced.
wasn't as advanced, right? And globalization wasn't as complete, right? Now you have China doing all of the world's low-end manufacturing, or almost all of it, right? And you have
And they're the number one robotic.
and they're the number one
importers.
robotics ones too. Yeah. And I mean other countries where there is manufacturing, it's very, very highly automated. So you don't need like manufacturing no longer has the promise of employing an entire national workforce and creating there's no path to that working class anymore, which is a really, really big historical change that I think we don't. I mean, I think at least in sociology, we haven't really addressed it, but that's we're too westernized here, I think.
It's an important piece of context, and just to return to that discussion with the Indian elites, you hinted at it during your talk, but without saying it explicitly. But there's a blame the victim kind of narrative that's ongoing among the elites, where you can just say, well, it's the supply side that is the problem.
Yes.
That's to say, these lazy workers or these lazy students who studied the wrong subject, but of course they're not telling you what the right subject is.
They don't tell you, and they're the ones who told them to go to study in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And they're telling them now, like they have the gall, really, to say, the same elites who 15 years ago tell us all these kids in these villages, farming sucks. Don't do farming anymore. It's embarrassing. It's like, it's you should be ashamed to be. They taught these people. They did two things, right? They taught kids like the sense of shame. That is a specific learned thing. It's not just the fact that it's like it doesn't work. It's like a shame, the cultural thing around farming. So it's like stigmatized now, right, to be a farmer. That was a deliberately constructed thing.
So you make your hands dirty, you're poor.
You're poor. It's a reminder of all these things, right?
Okay.
That you don't want to be. You shouldn't have to be in modern India. But they also consistently, farmers are, as we saw with the farm protests, farmers are very organized and they're very political in India, right? So they were always demanding specific things that would actually benefit the economic process of farming, things that would always see this in India. The number one thing they would ask for is roads and irrigation. Because if you have a road, you can get to the market faster. You have irrigation, you no longer need the monsoon. And that means you can predict, like that changes the whole game, right? You can continue doing farming and it's economically viable for you now to be a farmer. You can develop, these are things that you can't do yourself as a farmer. But if you had the state intervention in those two things, then now you can actually be a farming entrepreneur who can develop and build and grow and be more productive and do all these things and like actually, create something that maybe your kids want to do because they see that it's getting better every year. But that's not what the state would do. Instead is development meant giving loans to people, microcredit, things that would like pull them away. They're not building roads, not building infrastructure, not doing irrigation, but giving them money to make something else of themselves.
Right. See, I mean, just to go back to this, farm law issue, and the, high level of energy and protest that occurred against the government to make sure that the law is repealed. I mean, if we sort of extrapolate the line to the future, I mean, as you described, that, okay, today 42%, but you're going to go 30%, 20%, 10%, and gradually, perhaps the agricultural system is going to become like, Western, like European and American, with large, agricultural, corporations with whatever fertilizer, seeds, and tractors and everything. But then, as you said, with the premature deindustrialization, well, we're not absorbing that surplus agricultural labor into the manufacturing sector. So
Yeah, right.
so what is India going to become in the future? I mean, is it basically everyone wanting to become, a rickshaw driver or like a seller or like a vendor, street vendor, like?
I don't know. That's like the big. So this is where I think studying elite discourse is interesting, because it's like you have people who are talking about the future in a way, right? They're putting forward their own visions, and they're also trying to engaging in revisionist history while they do it. So it is this. You're right. Like structurally, there is this huge question. Farming is going down. Those people are not being absorbed. What's actually how people are dropping out, and it's like it is the single largest question I think that is motivating a lot of people in India right now is like what is going to happen with all these people. And I think honestly none of us we can't sit here and actually predict about, we don't know. It's all because it's all based on so many factors of like how people react, people respond. There are plans and there are new agendas that are being put forth, but they don't actually pan out, right? So going to the skills thing, this elite discourse around skilling, that I was so interested in. So basically, you had this original vision 20 years ago, right? And it's funny because it's I think one of the things that is so weird about working in this current time period is these things that we think of as taking hundreds of years or many years. they all happen so fast and they change so quickly. So just 20 years ago, there was this vision of this future India in which you had this educated youth who had left the villages, and they're now going to do all sorts of like modern jobs and like fuel the economy, right? It was so recent. I remember that kind of there used to be this political campaign by the BJP called India Shining.
Provide the education, the jobs will come.
Right, this sense of optimism that was everywhere,
yeah.
pre-financial crisis. And then that generation they get of age, they go in. Turns out they're not finding jobs. They keep entering the workforce every year. They're leaving their schools. They're not finding that they can't find any work and all that. And why aren't they finding jobs? I mean, there are not that many jobs there, right? There's no there are jobs. So where the jobs exist are in these highly specialized financial whatever industries, or they're in things that require very specific types of training, like to be a mechanic at a Boeing factory. You can't just go to school. You have to learn specific types of mechanics. You have to be standardized and certified in specific ways. That infrastructure didn't exist in India. It was just a general education infrastructure. So now they're going in and they're not finding jobs. So now you have the elites come in and they blame the victim, right? They're saying let's not mention the fact that we told you all to stop doing what you're doing and go to school. But what we're going to say is like, look at you, you've gone to school and you haven't learned anything. You're not good for, it's like there are all these jobs, but you're just not good enough to get them. And you don't have these skills, and everyone's saying that they don't have skills. Everyone means a different thing when they talk about skills, but it's convenient for them, for all different factions of elites, whether they're in the government or they head corporations, they run the Federation of Indian Industries, to say, oh my God, you don't have skills. What we're going to do now is we're going to put you in these skill training programs and these other things that will now make you good workers.
Which is really to kill time, to be a babysitter, essentially.
I think it's to kill. I don't think it's just to kill time. I think that effectively that's what it amounts to all the time. But I think it actually does. There is a real role there. So corporations, they want to, either they want them to be like very urban westernized elites. So when they talk about when corporations will say, oh, the problem with Indian workers is they're not fluent in English enough. They don't have the emotional qualities. They don't have like the comfort in group settings and all these things. What they're saying is we want.
So we'll give them English courses and.
No, they're saying you can go to college and you can't learn them. So what they're saying is they don't want upwardly mobile first generation students, who are coming from the countries. They want to protect elites that way, right? These jobs are only for elites, is what they're saying. They're only for the types of Indians who can speak English, who have been speaking English their whole lives, which is not very many of them.
No, but then what's the implication? I mean, to say to the first-gen college students, get out, or get a degree and just go away.
And just go away. No, I think that's what the power of this skill development discourse is. It's like, well, let's find something else for you. And the trainings that the corporate sector suggests are things like Salesforce has a Salesforce school, right? Where you learn on your phone how to be a good Salesforce representative. It doesn't guarantee you a job, but it does create the standing reserve of people who know how to use this particular platform. So they are able to play roles in the gig economy, right? All these gig economy jobs that are run by digital platforms, they have this learning component where you are trained in a specific way at no cost to the actual company itself and no guarantee of a job. But then now you are.
But you're like a standby.
You're a standby, and you have been made into a gadget that fits in the system now, right? You're not an auto driver. You're an Uber driver. It's such a big difference between being an auto driver. Who auto drivers have their own unions, they have their own rules, they have autonomy over what they do. And being an Uber driver is you are docile. You have to be. You can't resist the system. You have to be You have an automated manager. You have to listen to the robot that is your boss now, right?
And if you screw up in some manner that the system doesn't
Right,
recognize,
right.
you get cancelled essentially.
Right, right. You are, and it's like it's about. So it's like you have. It's like about taming what these people fear about the Indian labor markets, which is it's a chaotic place. You have workers who are constantly resisting in so many ways. People don't listen to you when it's against their interests. There's so many ways, so many forms of resistance. You have unruly workers everywhere in India. That's what the informal economy is. So for these big corporations, these big capital interests, they want people who are predictable and docile. The government too wants people who are predictable and docile, but for a slightly different reason, which is to basically to be able to attract large amounts of foreign capital. So the government can say, look, we have the system that gets you that can train, like, let's say you are a plane company, a car company, or whatever, and you need people who have XYZ and who have XYZ training or capability. So you're shopping around the world saying, where can I set up my factory, right? And I think I think, and I have to do more research to figure this out exactly. I think the way the government people see it, the government elites in India see it, is, okay, we can get a comparative advantage in this like market if we can tell Ford or whoever that if they want to set up a factory in India, they don't have to go to Africa to do it, even though labor might be cheaper there, because we're going to make it so that they don't have to worry about coming in and training a workforce and making sure the workers show up on time and they know what to do, and generating that. We're going to do all that for them so they can just go and they can hire it quickly or do it for any kind of service or something like that. But it wants to make these workers like recognizably join the global infrastructure, where it's like
Even
a
if
form
you're
of
not guaranteed a
professionalization.
job.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But it wants to professionalize them in this way in which they can play a more seamless role in the global economy. And I think that's where it becomes a story about autonomy and control over work, right? Where you have in India, you have a society where most people are self-employed. They are not working in like large organizational structures. They have, they are not, they're, I mean, that's a very loaded statement, I think, because you have, obviously, India has this long tradition of people being forced into labor all the time. But I think it also, it has something in which, like, in being a non-formalized economy, um, just like something like the act of work itself is not as regimented as it needs to be in order for the global economy to fully work. And you don't have the predictability that capital needs. You don't have the standardization that capital needs and all that. And for all those things, you actually have to have control, right? That's why all these like early historical sociology works on like labor and all that talks about control in the factory and timing and standard, and getting people to show up on time and changing, like exerting control over their work and all that. So I think there is this deeper question here of so for factories, for the Industrial Revolution to have like worked, it needed to like force workers to work in predictable ways, right? That was the genius of Henry Ford and Taylor and all these people.
But I guess the 21st century equivalent is that it's not only applicable to the factory setting, but even if you're an Uber driver, or if you do some kind of gig labor that's mediated through some digital platform,
Right. Yeah.
you still need to follow that regimented structure.
Yeah, it needs to create these. I mean, that's the thing that is so sinister, I think, about gig labor, is it's about creating. It's still creating specific types of workers, right? I don't know. I'm curious about your thoughts on this. But it's like the question is like, what kinds of workers need to be created? And I think Diana Enriquez, like she has like her work is on like freelancers, right? And I think she talks a little bit about like this like creation of like this culture of like like her. I mean, her. And I don't know if it's specific to hers, but it's like others have done this too. Of like this culture of like loving your work or like hustle culture and all these stuff, right? Where it's like, a good gig worker doesn't always have like money or a job, but they're like they have they have the sort of emotional countenance that you kind of like you need that these jobs expect. That's there's all that it's like that's what the service industry is too. You have to have people who are putting on the right kind of
Right.
face,
So you have to smile even though you're not happy.
even though you're
Essentially.
not right, right.
Yeah.
And it's like it's less about the technical know-how, right? It's like you take the old industrial jobs, the shop floor. It's like it's about controlling. You have to have workers who are regimented, who are standardized, who knew exactly the kinds of parts they had to work on, and they had the exact processes. They were very specialized in that. But so there was a lot of like technical knowledge that was like required of them, and also behavior that like sort of corresponded to that. And I think now we're going to this world in which you still need workers to be a certain way, but it's more of this like like of this appearance wise type thing.
Right.
And
So I mean, Ali Hochschild
yeah.
might be another interesting person,
Mm-hmm.
sociologist. The managed heart, and
Yeah.
so she talks about, I believe, the flight attendants, and having to display smiles to
Right, right.
customers
I
to
was
make sure
specifically
that
thinking about that. Yeah, yeah.
just to make them feel good, so that they're more willing to spend money. Essentially, I think that's a sort of
Yeah, and they're more willing.
assumption there, and that seems to be another form of industrial control,
Yeah.
and it seems to go much deeper than the sort of Taylorism, Braverman in the early 20th century, maybe.
Yeah,
Model.
I think so. I mean, I want to go to some of these skill development centers when I go to India and see like what is it that they're trying to teach these people, trying to get them to be, because I think it is a certain form of like subjecthood, right? That it goes very much deeper than just Taylorism. It's not just about your actions at work. It's about your identity and the kinds because if you look at all these skill development like policy documents and all that, that's something that they're constantly talking about. They want people who we want to inspire people to be motivated to become lifelong learners. That is very sinister, I think. They want you to. What does it mean for a government to want its population to become lifelong learners? Well, it means it wants a population who's willing to always go back to school and always and like is willing to remain optimistic in the face of constant automation or obsolescence or uh, absolute precarity in work, the inability of opportunities, and always be willing to go on to the next thing and willing to do the next thing because that is the logic of modern capitalism. Flexibility, unpredictability. You see every IMF, World Bank, whatever document talks about this as if it's an inevitable trend, even though which is funny because markets are created by people, but we talk about these new forces as if it's like it's the change in the weather, right? Like that flexibility, unpredictability is something that all workers have to be prepared for. And therefore workers have to be prepared. These are like the large when you look at like who's planning, the only people who are making plans for the future in this length are these major international organizations and states, right? And like industry groups. And they all talk about the same thing, which is we want a future in which workers are willing and optimistic about becoming lifelong learners. And I'm like, so what do they want is they want people who are always willing to look to the future and look at the next thing and like go on and are willing, no matter what your age is, what your position is, you're willing to go back to the drawing board. So turns out Uber has automated all of its driving force. You can't be an Uber driver anymore. That's okay. You're going to go and learn what the next thing, there's something else in which people are needed right now, right? But at least until that gets automated. So you no longer have the guarantee of like stability in that job or a lifelong career. You don't have, but you're okay with that. And I think that is where the battle is really, is
Yeah.
how do we get people to be okay with that? Skill development is exactly that. How do we get people to be okay with this new logic of work in which, you embrace your precarity and you embrace the constant threat of obsolescence. You embrace the this stupidity of the investment of education, right? Because you've educated yourself. That's supposed to be an investment. That's supposed to get you something, but it goes away in 5 years, and you are supposed to be okay with that, and supposed to be willing to do more, like willing to go back to the drawing board. And yes, we will help you because we will provide these training programs for you. We will subsidize them and all that. But it's like that's your life and that's your time, right? And the thing that's happening in India, which I'm excited to see when I'm there, is that the world's largest skill development program that they passed, supposed to train 400 million people in like by 2022, failed miserably. No one took the bait.
So what do you mean by failure?
So they developed this thing, fully optimistic, and I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but I should have, is they developed this thing saying we have this crisis, we have this skills crisis, right? So yes, the government and the state and industry were talking about very different concepts of skills, but they were both allied together in this project of fixing the skills shortage. And there is this huge government act saying it was the largest skill development program in history where they created a whole new system of vocational training to go alongside these schools. So all these sort of unemployed dropouts or graduates or whoever could now go to these vocational schools, and it's like we're going to provide you training in like something very specific and skilled. So we're going to give you a certificate to be a farmer. You're a farmer certificate now, right? So on the one hand, that does do this thing where it creates this new class of certified farmers who can be like treated separately from the uncertified farmers who are most farmers. And once you have that division, then the state can always go in and say, oh, we're only going to give like our subsidized water or like these agriculture subsidies to certified farmers. So fuck all you rest, right? But then it also does this other thing where it like sort of formalizes the informal economy from it creates this army of trained people, right? And it gives these people and it does all this stuff of like, yeah, we fucked up. We told all these kids to go to education. There's no jobs for them, but like now we're seen as doing something, and then all these things, right? But their mistake was thinking that Indians would love this idea that they like all these unemployed people,
Certifications.
yeah, they would be signing up because they're thinking, oh yeah, they're rational actors. They are. They don't have a job now. This will help them become more productive. It's a certificate. It's more than what you have right now, so it will help you find a job in something, right?
And the enrollment rates are very low.
Were almost non-existent.
Okay.
So 400 million was their ambition. They have trained to date maybe 30 million.
I mean, it's still a big number.
It's still a big
not,
number.
Not in Indian context.
Not in Indian context, but it's like, but it is what's clear is that people have not taken the bait, and I think that's where, I think if there's really a question something about like what is like really interesting about India in terms of labor and the future of capitalism and all that, it's this tension that I think is really playing out there, and I think it's also playing out in a lot of other places. Of we want to create this new type of docile worker, this new type of workforce, this new relationship to what it means to work. But it turns out the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, right? You can give a population education, you can put them in a shit situation, you can put them all in debt. You can make it so they don't have any opportunities and all that, but like they will still resist, right? They will not do the thing you want them to do, and the question is like why and what that means, right? So I think with like the Farm Bill, going back to your original question, this was like this. That's the significance of it, is that the neoliberalism has a very teleological agenda. Neoliberals talk about the future as if it were a thing that has already happened. This is what they always do, right? Any World Economic Forum thing, they are talking about the future as if it's a done deal, and they like, and that history has a singular line. All
Which is,
all
we
neoliberal
we all
liberal
love
logic is we all go
markets.
on the same. Yeah, exactly.
You
It's
know,
like the developing countries have to catch up and liberalize the same way, and they do all that, right? But
but you can't really sell that vision successfully. Well, you can sell it to the elites, obviously. I mean, whatever the government officials and whatever professors and stuff. But you're not going to be able to sell it to the masses
no,
because of, again, this premature deindustrialization, the lack of providing
yeah,
stable jobs, stable other
yeah.
upwards.
Turns out India can't be China, right? People in China agreed, they took the bargain. Where in China, famously, you had everyone agreeing to be factory workers, like our standard of living is rising and all these other things. Um, but that's not what's happening in India, because you don't have that replacement thing, that replacement livelihood to what people had before. So you have like intense farmer resistance to attempts to neoliberalize like the nature of agriculture, and they did the world's largest protest in history. No one, everyone thought these reforms were just a matter of time. I mean, you look at studies of like reforms in these countries, and you know, protests are seen as a minor encumbrance or like just a problem on the way to this end that needs to happen. You know, like that this farm bill needs to happen, and there's no room for political alternatives, right? There's only simply, how quickly or how efficiently can this country get to that path.
Now,
But
at a macro level, I mean, I think the neoliberals have a point.
mhm.
Because again, I go back to this statistic about agricultural employment, which is declining. I mean, if we ever get to a point where you could reverse those trends, you could lure people from the cities, from the whatever service sector jobs back into the farmlands. I think then in that case, I think
But
you
my
could make the argument that we're getting rid of the neoliberal project.
Yeah, but my point is that, but even that decline of agricultural employment, that isn't just like a given reality about the world. That was made and that was created. That happened because you had these developmental agendas that went in and told people, that said, we're not going to provide irrigation and roads to your farming, but like we're going to tell your kids to really go to school, and we're going to really push education, and we're going to push like you know debt driven consumption and debt driven entrepreneurship, but we're not going to do like the two things that can actually improve your ability to farm, right? So like that decline from 60 to 40% happened like not naturally, not because the world unfolded that way. It's because like that was part of the
Yeah,
agenda.
but what's the total agricultural output like in terms of
I mean that I
tons of
agree.
rice and wheat and whatever
I mean,
getting
it is
produced?
like it's the least productive one, because in terms of, because it has the most, like it has the most population, but it's like, yeah, you can't like in terms of value added, it's like the lowest value added.
Lowest value added,
Yeah.
but in terms of output, it must have grown to feed the population,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, no, it's grown. I mean, that was
But the
one
value
of the
added goes
early,
down. I see.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, one of the early developmental things. I mean, actually, the Green Revolution in India was like very much about increasing agricultural output. That was a very like 20th century way of thinking about development, right? Where we want to increase, we're going to keep these things
Yeah, but
as
it's a form of automation that's happening in the agricultural sector, right? Once you do that, I mean, once you say, okay, don't use the old method of growing
yeah.
your seeds, your crops. Uh, you know,
I mean, it's not a form, because automation again. It's like I think that goes down to like is it labor augmenting, or is it labor replacing or substituting, right? Like I mean,
yeah,
like
well,
you
if the
can,
population is growing faster than the productivity increases, then
yeah,
yeah, I think it's labor intensive.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But I mean, if the productivity rises at a faster rate, I would think it is a form of automation eventually, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's like because productivity increases can happen from so irrigation is out, that's not automation. We've had irrigation for so long, right? Irrigation is simply about distribution of water.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, it depends what
but it
system, what
increases
type of
agricultural
system.
productivity. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but it
You know,
depends what kind of, I mean, how that irrigation is being done. I mean, how many workers do you need
yeah,
to
yeah.
run?
But I think you're thinking about this in I think you're assuming it's like much more advanced than it actually is. Like the thing about a place like India is you have advanced, highly automated industries, but then you have people farming as if the same way that people farmed in 500 AD.
Yeah,
It's like both of those things exist. So
right. So that's
like
the
yeah, yeah.
42%
It's
basically.
like
Yeah,
it's
that's
like
right. Yeah,
so. What do you do with that person who's farming as if it was 1,500 years ago?
yeah.
You can help them farm better and more efficiently, and you don't have to they can be doing so many things that would like improve like that would like improve their they would genuinely benefit from productivity, right? Like if you can give them irrigation, you can give them whatever better tools and all those things. Um, but what it's actually done is not that. It's like a different way of thinking about the system. It's not about maybe let's bring that person who farms like it's 1,000 years ago more up to speed. We can modernize like their conditions, or we can just pull them away and change what they do and change their role in the economy, right?
Now, okay, so let's try to paint a more positive picture, given all of the depressing things that we as sociologists study
Mm-hmm.
all the time. Um, you know, what is the positive vision that we could sell? The young population. I mean, is it to say, you know, um, yeah, go back to the farm and disconnect from the market system, which ends up selling you like false idols,
No, we can't tell them to go. We can't do
or is
that.
it about doubling down on the neoliberal agenda and let's bring the market forces even quicker in because we want to
I
raise the levels of GDP as quick as possible.
I mean, I don't know. Like, people ask me this question all the time. I have no fucking idea. Like, what is the positive vision? I mean, look, we don't even have to provide our own positive vision because I realize, like, when I'm in India, like, people already articulate their own visions that they want, so we can listen to them. And I mean, I don't know. That's one of my genuine research questions. Like, what do these people want, right? They're in this situation. They're the ones who are actually in that situation. What do they want? Because they don't want to go back to farm. Like they could, but it's like they often like don't want to do that, or they can't because maybe the farmland in their family has been sold or mortgaged to finance their education. But often, like a lot of the vocal demands, the fights over like youth unemployment, the protests around them, mainly are like, give us government employment. They want the state to provide employment. You know so it's like they want like that's like the system. So
And
it's like
there's an assumption about where the state is going to generate the tax revenues to support these
they
public
don't. I
sector
mean, it's like
jobs.
they don't care about where the that's not their job to figure out where the money comes from. It's like maybe people like us is like it's like our job, but it's
Yeah,
like
right. I mean, eventually you'd have to. I mean, the only thing you could do is you have to squeeze the people with lots of money. And I'm sure, like I think you shared an article with me once, like billionaire Raj or something. I mean,
yeah,
like the
yeah.
whole idea of like there are a few multi-billionaires in India, and uh, I mean, how do they get wealthy in the first place? I mean, is it about ownership of or like a monopoly concession of like
Yeah,
a
I mean,
particular
there's all that of like the license, like liberalization, like who benefit. It's like there was a fire sale and all that, and like people benefiting off of that. But also, I mean, the so in India you have this high growth economy, right? that has not created any employment growth. So where did the growth all come from? Something is growing, and it is these like highly productive, high productivity, low labor, like capital intensive service sectors everywhere. That's where
The
the
financial services
financial
industry.
services, all the yeah, and especially that have benefited from not just like global market, but from the domestic market. India is still a huge domestic market, right? And it's like the things of like the people who benefit when everyone, a billion people start using cell phones or start
So
like
the cell phone
the cell
provider,
phone
yeah,
or microfinance and micro lending. It's like now people, instead of going to the village money lender, they're going to a company and doing that. I mean, and now that money can be instrumentalized and all that in everything, right? Securitized. I mean, so you have these people who have what we call productivity. It's like when we talk about productivity growth, it contains all these different things, right? But it's basically the people who have benefited are the ones who benefited from this growth, these massive changes in consumption patterns, this massive growth in like capital oriented, trade intensive like services. The people who have benefited basically from the increase of money in the economy that didn't wasn't accompanied by the increase in jobs, right? So you like this is the problem that we're facing everywhere. There's more money. This goes back to our like blog discussion too. There's more money than ever. There's just no jobs. So
right, yeah.
it's like it's like the people who can get the money are the ones who are getting super rich.
Right. I mean, if you, I mean,
Because jobs used to be the way in which money was distributed before, and it's no longer that. Yeah.
yeah, right. So if you look at the trends, particularly the last 13 years or so since the '08 global financial crash,
Yeah.
we've seen that, the stock market has completely divorced from the trends of the, underlying sort of real economy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where essentially, I mean, if you recall, in the beginning of the pandemic, oh my God, there's going to be, a run in the market because, all these companies are not making any money. The stocks should be collapsing. And yet, last year was probably the best year in record for the stock market. I mean, 40% increase in, the past year. I mean, this year it might be a little bit less, maybe 30% or something, but still, pretty good. Um,
Yeah, it's insane.
a-
Yeah.
and you could, I mean, like last year you had declines of the economy between 6 to maybe 10%, depending on the OECD country. Um, and I mean, the way how that divorce sort of happens, I would think, is monetary policy, right? Specifically, I mean, if the central bank sort of comes in and says, oh, you cannot pay off your debt, no worries, we're gonna buy up your corporate bonds, and then all of a sudden your interest rate goes down. And the same thing is being done with governments who are borrowing so much money to, save companies and, pay unemployment insurance and so forth. So, see, I mean,
I mean, I would be careful, cautious about that because it's not just as simple as saying monetary policy alone, because there have been famous disasters of monetary policy where the government does try to print more things and it just creates hyperinflation, right? So it's like really like how is this able to happen without hyperinflation? Uh, but clearly like the amount of dollars has increased in the economy, right? That also has to do with yeah monetary policy, and I think that is a super important where like what you're saying with quantitative easing and all that. That's like that's a very super important way in which yeah
well, because because the money that gets printed, it goes straight into the financial sector. I mean, and as long as most of that money doesn't get liquidated, so whatever money that you and I put in the stock market, we, sort of say to ourselves, let's
mm-hmm.
wait for it to grow, and I'm not going to be, touching it to, whatever, buy myself a new computer or something. So I would think like as long as you, you know, sort of don't inject a lot of these, we could say savings in the stock market, as long as you don't sell the shares, I would think that the inflationary pressure is limited, and that's why I
Well,
like.
as long as I think what you're saying is like as long as most people don't get the money, as long as only some people
That was
get
the other thing I was going to say, right? Income inequality, wealth inequality, because
well, capital inequality, really.
right, capital inequality. I mean, where so if Elon Musk, with like whatever, almost $300 billion that he has, he waits another year with 40% growth, he will be at what, over 400 billion, $420 billion, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just by holding his own stock, essentially.
By holding his own stock, and like, because I think this is like, I don't know, I might be very wrong on this. I want to read more like maybe economic historians and some people who have like been writing about this thing, because it's like I've always thought this, where it's like the state does like, okay, like the Fed does all this printing, like buys all these like assets, right? So basically it's injecting all these dollars into the financial markets.
Mm-hmm.
So like people who have like money in the financial market, they can, no matter what's actually going on in the economy, they're seeing incredible growth, right? But that money, the thing that's enabling that and not creating like runaway hyperinflation, is the fact that everyone else, all the people who are actually buying things, which is everybody, they don't have like suddenly 100, like twice as much money with which to buy things, right? So if we all had twice as much money as we had yesterday, then all the prices would be twice as high, because with like, so like there's, that's just inflation, right? But it's like
But if you only give it to Jeff Bezos,
if you're only giving it to Jeff Bezos, and you're only giving it to like whoever, the small class of people who have, because the financial market, like that is the system of that's the system of distribution for the Fed, and it's not going from the financial markets to the rest of the economy, then it's only those people are going to get richer.
right, and without having that inflationary pressure. But then at the same time, I think the current discussions where we're having 5% inflation now, which in terms of recent memory, it is quite unusual,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, the last inflationary episode in most Western countries was probably like, I want to say early 1980s, maybe late 70s, and then you had the Volcker shock, right? It was a former chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, that changed the whole architecture.
Yeah, right. So basically, for the last 40 years, over a generation where, none of us has sort of direct memory of, high levels of inflation. So we always had this assumption that, the prices ought to be stable. But now all of a sudden it goes up, and there's this argument now that we say, hey, in the labor market, there's supposedly this grand reckoning, right? Where, you see headlines where, great resignation, basically people, quitting jobs because, they don't want to be paid so little and get so little recognition.
Yeah.
And then the companies have to hike the wages. But then if you hike the wages without hiking productivity, then there will have to be some inflation that goes back into the economy. So obviously, I mean, these things, it's a very short term, I would say, right? I mean, we're really talking about like just the last couple of months where the inflation indicators have been increasing. But what's your comment on this sort of like neoliberal narrative of worker empowerment, post-pandemic or in the middle of a pandemic?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like, it seems like it's like a strange time to talk about worker empowerment when we've just had a pandemic and we had one of the worst labor shocks like ever. And it's like, you also, I think you have people who are just, I mean, it's not really empowerment what you're doing is saying, I'm just choosing not to do this absolute shit job. It's like, it's like I was listening to this. I think there was this Adam Two's podcast today on it, and they were saying, it was only happening in like hospitality, industries where people in the last year it's been very difficult to work in them, right? Because when the pandemic happened, suddenly you were all put out of a job, and then once you were coming back, you had to deal with people anti-maskers, like people yelling because you had to be the ones who were enforcing these lockdown. These lockdown restrictions, and you're working at like a CVS or something. I mean, it's just like those jobs got really shitty, like even shittier after the pandemic started, right? Or people working maybe in like hospital in medical industries. Like there's been a lot of attrition there, which also makes sense. It's like those have been that's been one of the hardest places to work. So yeah, I mean, I think for the one thing, it's like it's like yes, people are. It's been really interesting to see these supply shortages, but I think like the panic about them is kind of like strange. I always thought it was strange because like these are the same industries where you just laid off people en masse in 3 weeks, right? So like
Yeah.
to say like to be like, oh my God, why won't people come back to work at Chili's? It's kind of it's like I mean, come on, man. You just like you got rid of all of them like just in 1 week, and then now you're like
Now you want them
and now
back,
you want them
and
back in
yeah.
1 week. It's like obviously you got rid of them for 1 week, and they had to like be like they had nothing for months and months, and people really suffered in America too until like either there was generally eventually a stimulus and everything, but for a long time people were really worse off, right? Until Joe, I know, especially before like Biden passed all these other like these fiscal policies.
But that's why I think the stimulus check plan. I mean, we had 3 stimulus checks. I thought that was a great intervention.
I thought it was an amazing intervention.
For anybody who's I mean, full disclosure, I'm in the basic income movement here. So for many of us, I mean, we are extremely delighted about that intervention, and the sort of new discourse that's legitimated. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
we can give free money to people. We're not expecting them any direct service or work in return. And I think that idea is becoming much more acceptable in the in the more automated world, and in the more, and coming out of this pandemic, right? So
Yeah.
I very much like that idea.
What do you think about, but like, I don't know, what about that with like in terms of how it ties in with inflation though?
Well, right. So that would be our earlier point here, right? Where, okay, if the stock market only benefits Jeff Bezos, there's no inflation. If it were to benefit, the average Joe, maybe it would spill over into the real economy, because obviously the average Joe is gonna basically spend a bigger percentage of his income on the on the goods and services in the economy, and that could have inflationary pressure. So okay, my response to that, so that first of all, there's a lot of different factors that could account for inflation. I wouldn't say that the government stimulus measures were the biggest cause of it. You could say it was the energy shortages, right? So the fact that, I mean, if you go to the gas station, pump gas, well, why is it much higher? Well, because in the pandemic they were they were shutting down the refineries and the extraction facilities and so forth.
But gas is often excluded from inflation calculations, right? Like it's
Well, yeah, I mean, so but then if you actually go to the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, who do the breakdown of inflation figures, energy, food, and then general prices. You will see that the big spike actually is just with the energy prices.
itself.
And then now the energy prices, I mean, the way how our capitalist economy works is that, everything is tied to energy to some extent, because for instance,
It's an input in there, yeah.
right. So with food, right? So you have to burn the fossil fuel to maybe produce the food products. You have to transport
Hmm.
these goods in containers and ships and trucks and so forth. So so that's another factor of inflation. I mean, completely aside from whether labor's empowered or whether we had stimulus checks, which has to be taken into account in the current inflation rate. But okay, but let's um, take the UBI critics by the word, and let's assume that the stimulus checks were behind inflation. If that were to be the case, then obviously you couldn't do basic income in exactly that shape. You know, there's a reason also why like Social Security, as a government redistribution program, is non-inflationary.
Hmm.
And I think the main reason is that you draw it from the taxes. I mean, if you said I cut out 6%,
You're not
out of
printing
your
that money, yeah.
right. So I mean, you're basically redistributing out of the present funds, and ideally, I think that's how we should talk about basic income too. I mean, if you recall the Andrew Yang, he said 10% value added tax. That's a big source of money, of revenues. That's just one example.
But don't you think that that actually does run into this thing where we have money printing for the Jeff Bezoses, right? It allows them to amass an incredible wealth because we're pumping money like that is like created, that is printed money. It's not simply taxed and redistributed money. It's newly printed money that's being sent into the system, but it stays in that system to a small amount. Um, okay, because you look at these old footages of the Weimar Republic and these other sources, cases of hyperinflation, right? And you see people holding these wheelbarrows full of money and all that. And I always thought that was really interesting because it's like, where did you even get that money from? So the government printed, but it's like it meant like average people suddenly had access to huge stacks of money, right? In this like worst nightmare scenario, people were able. So it's like they were like it was like a billion whatever of that currency. It's coming out, and it's like, but like it was still going to enough people. This huge numbers of of currency. It was like going to enough people where they can then use it and use it to the point where I actually have enough bills to take to like a um, to like the coffee shop and only to realize that the prices had already gone up, right? Everybody has to have access to that much money in order for this to happen. But like what we see with something like quantitative easing is like financial markets go up by 30%, 40%. They're like well protected, and suddenly someone like Jeff Bezos, it's like his money's doubling, and yeah, sure, that is also coming from productive growth and real growth and all that, but it's also clearly coming from this quantitative easing.
Okay, yeah,
Clearly, right?
Yeah.
But it's like it's just not going. But like since not if everybody had that, um, if everybody had that and everyone just like was able to benefit, then it would actually cause inflation.
And if
right?
they were to cash it out,
And they were to cash it out, right?
Yeah.
But like, so now that you have that going on the one end, right? And let's say now you are taxing Jeff Bezos and giving it to everybody else. So the only thing that's keeping inflation from not rising when the government prints this money is like is the fact that like only a small elite class can benefit, right? Yeah. But I think once you start taxing that class and like giving that to elsewhere, then aren't you actually redistributing the inflation now, or the inflationary pressure?
Yeah, that could very well be the case. And look, I mean, I'm not an economist, but I think that if you wanted to design a viable UBI program, it would have to take the shape similar to the Social Security
Social Security thing, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like really, where we would have to do, very strict accounting, and we'd have to evidently produce enough of the tax revenues. But I think that, the biggest issue that we're facing in our political economy, at least in the rich countries, I mean, I'm not so sure about poorer countries like India, is mainly a question of distribution, and not so much of, how do we increase, GDP even further, and and also there's a big contradiction that we are facing. I mean, because we only talked about the social contradiction of capitalism, which is, what's the end game if Jeff Bezos owns everything and everybody else is poor. But I think the second, end game deals with ecology, and so there was this analysis by Gaia Harrington, and she's a management consultant at KPMG, but she produced a great report, which is to update the limits to growth thesis by the Club of Rome, you recall in 1972.
Where the population control people.
Right, population control, but it's one among many things that they were concerned about. They had this, Malthusian fear that, pollution is going to be too high, population unsustainably high, not enough resources, everything will collapse, right? Now, what Harrington did was she basically, fed some new data into the models of Club of Rome and updated it. And her prediction about the business as usual scenario, basically keeping, our energy mix, our fossil fuel consumption and things like that, and energy consumption, keeping it the same, we are headed for collapse in the 2040s. Which is, I mean, it's maybe less than a generation away, I guess, and maybe we might be a little bit too young and still experience that. Now, I guess, her assumption here is that, we read the reports, take it seriously, and perhaps do something to mitigate beforehand. That's a very optimistic take, obviously. I mean, if you look at the COP26, which was the climate change conference that was just concluded a few days ago, Greta Thunberg, of course, didn't like it, and neither did lots of environmental activists, and there's good reasons to dislike what happened there. Two complications, right? So the first is we're not able to get the big emitters, China, India increasingly, not because of per capita, but because the population
overall,
is so big. Yeah, exactly. So we don't get the firm commitments to definitively phase out coal, which is one of the supposedly cheaper sources of energy for developing countries, but of course with the highest carbon impact. And then the second problem we are facing is what's called climate finance, which is the idea that the rich countries are subsidizing the poorer countries, the developing world, it's like a mixture of loans and grants, but I think more on the grant side, to fund their energy transition, basically allowing them to leapfrog the dirty coal. And so far, only $600 billion had been spent on it, and much more is required. But they didn't. There's a lot of you could say selfishness, perhaps, among the rich countries. And the thing is, you couldn't get the countries to make a higher commitment. So all you could say is, next year we're going to do COP again, and we're going to up the ante, hopefully, at that point. And what does it tell us? Well, it tells us that that any kind of optimistic scenario about, you know, you know, getting energy transition, having a more sustainable ecological model um, within our capitalistic system is just illusory at this point.
Yeah.
And on top of that, of course, the thing that sociologists are concerned about, which is, can we sustain a polity if the inequality is growing too much, is also happening. So,
Right, and those two things kind of work. They have their own like relationship there too, which is, I think, not something that gets discussed a little bit, but I think, yeah.
yeah. So I wrote a blog post maybe last year or so, and I said that social justice and environmental justice are orthogonal, which is to say, they actually work at cross purposes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in the social justice argument, the way how I define it specifically in my context, I mean, I'm not interested in the culture war stuff, but social justice specifically is about the idea that less developed countries, so poorer countries like India, are allowed to become rich,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, allowed to live the same lifestyle that people in North America enjoy. And the environmental justice framework is that the planet is inhabitable for future generations. For of course for Greta Thunberg maybe, and for even the people that's not born yet. And this cross purpose, we can't do. We're not able to combine these things at the moment.
I mean, yeah, but it's also because we're so fixed on this idea of like what development ought to look like and all that. I mean, as we've just spent all this time talking about, India's developmental trajectory has not benefited many of its people, most of its people. I mean, yeah, actually, I take that back. There has been a great evolution away out of poverty and all that, right? But that's only like part of it. Like, poverty has gone down, maternal mortality is down, all these things, like hunger is down. Those things are wonderful, but those, I think, were processes that happened separately to the neoliberal market GDP growing type of things. Like, those are not one-to-one related. I think they're like the stuff that I'm talking about is this other thing that's happening, these much larger processes that are happening on top of that don't have to do with the elimination of poverty, really. That have to do with another thing of like of agendas of how to structure a society and its markets, right? So you look at a country like India, which will be really badly affected by climate change, right? Like this like growth trajectory that it's been on has already created this standing reserve of people, right? We are generating these surplus populations as these countries grow everywhere. And that's what inequality is also doing, is these like sort of things that are driving like globalization or automation or whatever, all the ways in which they are driving up inequality within countries, creating super wealthy people and these mass standing reserves of perhaps educated, perhaps not, but basically surplus populations everywhere. I mean, don't you think that actually changes the incentives for like what to do about climate change and how bad climate change is actually going to be?
Well, it's going to create, more reactionary forces, right? That is to say, well, I mean, we already have the evidence in hand. I mean, if you look at the, Assam citizenship fiasco, where the idea was we're just gonna block out Muslims who might have lived there for generations of keeping the citizenship, and that's really a way to please and placate you could say the Hindu core electorate.
But sure, yeah, I think that's happening. But think about the elite here, though. We have a society that in every country that's increasingly structured between the super wealthy and then the rest who have like increasingly less, who are more precarious, who have less and less political power, who are less sort of who play like less consequential roles in the functioning of society, right? That's the weird thing about
And are more
inequality.
susceptible to the demagoguery.
Who are more susceptible to the demagoguery too. Yeah, yeah. But whom where I think like if you have this but who are susceptible to demagoguery but who are less constant like who can't like do things like go on strike anymore. Right? They can't like stop the wheel. They don't have like they can vote. That's true. They can still vote maybe, but like they don't have these other ways of like making their impact on society and like social consequences, like consequential decisions made by planners, like felt. I mean, the farm protests were like an example. And I think they're increasingly kind of an exception to the rule. Like, think about how are gig workers supposed to protest? They can try, but like you see in the West like how strikes are kind of they're just not they don't do what they used to do, right? Strikes aren't like they're not as threatening
But
anymore.
the solidarity is so difficult, right? Where it's
Mm.
like the Uber driver is not necessarily gathering in a room or in a hall of other Uber drivers, and in the same way that the farmers, maybe they have maybe the WhatsApp groups and say, hey,
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
go to Delhi and put the streets on fire.
Well, they're not getting, but it's also the fact that like it used like they're not also shutting down economies as much as like strikes were so devastating in the past because they lit a fire under the ass of people in power, right? Like they were actually shutting, and that's the thing that made like strikes so felt is like let's say if all the electricity, like the power plant workers, go on strike, well, then it's lights out, and it's a big problem not just for like ordinary people, but for especially for the people in charge, right? It's a big problem for them when this happens. So I think in general, like automation, like when I say that it creates a surplus population, it puts people increasingly in this position where they can't actually do something that disrupts like the ordinary functioning of society. But I think that also means that now, I don't know, like I wonder, I'm curious if you agree with this. Because I think about this, and the reason why I feel so cynical about climate change sometimes is, when climate change happens and it gets really disastrous, it's not going to be disastrous for everybody. It could be disastrous for most people, but it will still be possible for a small number of people to live pretty good lives. They can move to Canada. Or New Zealand. They can move, or like, Norway or something. It's not like the whole world isn't going to go up in flames. It's just the world that was able to support most people will be, but it will still. So if we
Well,
have,
it's not yet. I think.
yeah,
I think eventually your fortress, New Zealand or Canada, is going to be fucked as well.
I don't know. But what if they're able to? What if they see a future in which like they have enough automation? They have robots who can do most of the things. They can take care of their own consumption. So maybe most people are living in misery, but it's okay as long as they can look after themselves, right? Like if
Yeah, if you say if it's on this planet, I am actually quite pessimistic. If you said that the Bezos Musk vision gets realized, where they say, "Hey, why don't we, go up to the moon, to the space, and we create
but
some
in
giant space
in
station."
what world is like that easier climate wise to survive in the moon?
Yeah, it probably is not. It's
Than on
probably is
Earth,
not.
even in a climate changed Earth, it's still more inhabitable than the fucking moon. There's no air there. Like It will always be more inhabitable. Yeah.
Right, well, well, I mean, might not be the moon, but they'll create like think of like a giant satellite,
Yeah.
which were to support, not a giant, but maybe like a small scale human civilization, and maybe you can even keep some animals there, and
Yeah, I mean,
grow
sure, you
food or
can do
whatever.
like a small, but I think that will always be a small scale thing. I mean, really, it's like I think it's like, yeah, I don't know. I like the thing I worry about the most is like when shit goes bad and south, will most people even have the means anymore to resist it or to find alternatives or to all that? Or will we all be forced into increasing precarity, increasing like disaster, disruption, while the true elites can like can like because it's like climate change, we see it's really the elites who keep fucking this up, right? They're not doing the thing. They're not doing that. Like none of us have. There's no democratic process in climate change negotiations. We just have to wait and see what they tell us. Like, yeah, sure, you can vote for Biden versus Trump, but that's like a very limited thing in terms of what's actually going on with these negotiations that are going all the time, right? And it is ultimately in the control of the true power elite what happens with climate change. And maybe there was a situation in which, we will be able to actually hold them accountable. But what if we
But
go
also
into
the power elite, I mean, isn't this unified
that's true,
cabal,
yeah.
right? I mean, I mean, you do have multiple, um, you could say power elite positions. You could say perhaps the Cold War between U.S. and China, and then Europe might be another bloc. That's part of it. Then, of course, the private, multinational corporate sector. I mean, they have their own interests. You know, it's actually one of the key characteristics of the neoliberal system that maybe you don't have exactly one power center, right? That
Right.
you have these lots of your market interactions, market transactions, and people are differentially integrated into the market. Now there's some concentration happening, obviously. Like if you saw the Zuckerberg metaverse commercial, right, where he says that he puts us all into with these goggles, and we get to be in the metaverse,
Yeah.
joining him there, and um, but that sort of vision sounds as if it was universalizing, right? It's like I'm selling you a vision, and you're going to be part of it. And by the way, I mean you're already part of it. I mean, if you use Messenger, WhatsApp, I mean we are plugged in to the system anyway.
Yeah.
That a powerful man and a few powerful people are deciding upon. Um, and so I mean I think ultimately I think it goes back to the sort of like this Max Weber thesis, right? Is that the iron cage that we set ourselves up to be part in
Mm-hmm.
is going to basically squeeze tighter and tighter,
Yeah.
and I don't know, all we can do as sociologists maybe is to point it out and to kick and scream about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so we're just trying to think about what is the. So I mean, of course, we can continue drawing sort of these dystopian visions about the future, but sort of on the on the shorter term. I mean, if we imagined the problems of the world away, which is very hard for us to do as sociologists because our raison d'être is to study the social problems. But you know, what I mean, just as a broader, ethical life philosophy. I mean, what's the purpose of our existence? I mean, you know,
Uh, what is the purpose of our job as a sociologist? I have no idea. Honestly, I don't know.
no,
I
as,
mean,
as human
but as
beings,
human beings,
not just as
oh, as
sociologists.
human,
Yeah.
I mean, look, I think I've thought about this a lot, and I can only come up with one, at least for me. I don't know. It's not something I would preach to others, but I don't know. Time may be limited, honestly, the way we have it, but it may not. Just enjoy it while we can. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this pandemic. I've spent a lot more time in nature. I feel like, and it's just kind of like, okay, like, you know, just going to enjoy this as much as I can. I'm gonna enjoy, like, yeah. And maybe that's also a dystopian kind of view in a way, but um, I I don't know what it is that's like worth fighting for. I mean, it's like I do feel like I'm in this position where all I can see is like the negativity and the dystopian aspects of it, and it makes it so that my politics can be very critical, but I don't know how to make my politics more positive. All I know is how to make my day-to-day life more positive, which is by, you know, enjoying it as much as I can.
Uh, yeah, I would very much agree with that sentiment, because so I mean in an objective sense, if somebody said to you, well, this is what your purpose is, this is what your purpose is, which a lot of religions, are trying to do exactly that, right? They're telling you, believe in this figure or believe in this deity, and your meaning will sort of be being embedded in that sort of community and this way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of have a very hard time believing in that. I mean, maybe I'm too much of an empiricist, been too obsessed with things that are countable and measurable, you can see and feel. Um, so I would go back to a quote by Richard Feynman. He was a very famous physicist, died 40 years ago, but said, it doesn't matter what the purpose of existence is. We're never going to figure it out anyway. So all you can really do is to find something, a domain that you're passionate in, and then you keep doing it for as long as you like. And any other obligations that you have, which, I guess in his view, it could be like family, it could be work, it could be administrative stuff, should be kept to a minimum,
Mm-hmm.
so that you get to be yourself to the greatest extent. So your and my neoliberal existence is to sort of pretend to some extent that we're the greatest scholars
Right,
that ever
right,
existed.
right.
We make this amazing field work, this quantitative analysis, whatever else.
Yeah, yes. Market,
Um,
peddle our ideas.
Yeah, we peddle our ideas and we fill all the lines in our CV. But I can tell you the biggest satisfaction that I have had, just time in Princeton or back in Oxford. Well, yeah, I was hanging out with friends, hanging out with colleagues, um, you know, over beer, or, or like this, and like a podcast setting. It is, yeah, it is like leisure time reading, uh, and writing blogs,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So things that are, you could say, not um, recognizable by sort of social standards. It's not, things that are socially held in high esteem. But I
The
thought
logic of productivity and growth.
the logic of productivity and growth. But
Yeah.
in terms of the personal growth, I mean, in terms of
Yeah.
personal enjoyment and enrichment, um, I, I thought this has always been, the most valuable experience. I mean, that's why I'm so keen to, um, you know, continue on the podcast adventure, you could say.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like it's like that's what I feel like. Maybe I don't know. This is someone else. I hope they will investigate this further as like a project. But it does seem like one of the strange things that climate change has done as this existential crisis is actually create that highlight that even more. That you must. What makes most sense is to focus on those things that just give you joy. Hang out, do leisure, whether it's leisure or hanging out or whatever. The thing that is like because it's like I feel like climate change disrupts the basic sort of like calculus of like the utilitarian calculus, where it's like you do something now, it pays off in the future, and there is like, but that requires like at least the ability to
Like
continue
discounting the present.
yeah, discounting the present, exactly. Yeah, and the ability to, and also having a perpetual future in which you can kind of keep going on, or like having these kinds of like plans in which there will be this payoff. So economic development used to have that big, right, where it was like you can always have growth, and then soon we will all be rich, and there's something in which we can all aspire to. So therefore, you should work and you should do all this so that can happen. I mean, now you're telling me what in 2040 it's like gonna go to. So like.
Well, yeah. Let's hope that Mrs. Harrington's numbers are wrong.
Right, but
But
that's our lifetime, yeah.
Yeah, and we'd have to react very quickly. I mean, certainly at the policy level, and there's compromises involved in people's lifestyle for sure. I mean, the idea that, well, maybe you shouldn't be driving cars, consuming less animal proteins. I mean, not taking airplanes. I mean, there's such deep alterations in our personal lives that's required without even knowing that it's going to save us. Like even with the current pandemic, it's something really short term, right? Where remember it was in April or May, when the government officials, the CDC officials told us, get the 2 shots, the pandemic is over, right? I mean, of course, the logic didn't work because Delta is highly transmissible. Breakthrough infections are rising because of the waning immune protection. I mean, it's still highly efficacious against severe disease,
Sure.
But certainly in terms of bringing a pandemic to the end, we know that this wasn't happening. And so and I mean, in my home country in Austria, I mean, they said we're going to do a lockdown only for the unvaccinated, because the idea was because of the too much sick people getting into overwhelming the ICU units, right, in the hospitals. Because the logic was, well, we didn't want to punish the people who did the right thing, which is to get vaccinated. But then, if you wanted to follow the proper epidemiology science, you would say, no, actually, we probably do need a generalized lockdown. And now that's actually what they did. Just 1 week later,
They changed it to overall.
they changed it to an overall lockdown now. And of course, everybody's furious. I mean, the politicians are. I mean, because they had to sort of bite their own words. But interestingly, I mean, not out of malice, but just because of the the changes in the epidemiological situation, which was basically unanticipated, right? And for me, it's like, I mean, imagine like this current pandemic, which will come to an end, is it's like the fire drill almost. The fire alarm, of course, being climate change, a climate disaster, um, and we know we're doing a terrible job at it, of managing these disasters. So that's why when I go back to, well, what's the meaning of life is, well, I mean, on the political front, it means, you know, I support Greta Thunberg. I support, her level of activism, the School Friday for Future protest movement. But at the really, really micro level, I mean, if I was, to give a friend an advice, it's carpe diem. I mean, it's enjoy enjoy this planet while you can, essentially.
It's like maybe that's like a, I don't know, maybe that's like a contradiction of climate change, and I have like two thoughts here. One is like maybe this is like a pretty basic fundamental contradiction, and maybe it's like something that I don't know how many people feel this way, but could be something that is like part of the problem is this possibility of an apocalyptic future, a very disruptive future, then increases, like, tells you not to discount the present anymore, to carpe diem. So to do that, right? But then the only way of avoiding or prolonging that apocalyptic future is to do simply the opposite, right? Is to do the cutting down, the self-restrictions, all that. So to not carpe diem, but to do all these things, that may or may not actually do anything in the first place. So it's like the way to avoid that situation is by doing exactly the opposite of like what it is that you want, you should be doing, or you think, you might be compelled to do, given this like inability to see past a certain future, which is
but carpe diem, I mean, it could be low carbon, right? I mean, so I for instance, don't have the desire necessarily to, buy a car or to go, faraway islands. I think.
But that's not the case for a lot of people, like they might be, if you take climate change seriously, right? And then you're like, I mean, I don't know. It's weird because a lot of people who are like, I want to buy my SUV and whatever, are all, I mean, they also probably don't take climate change. It's like, it's a weird, I think the way in which everyone is thinking about the future, I don't know. I wonder what's going on with all of that, because it's like, it's a very weird kind of situation.
Because you can block it out, right?
You can block it out, yeah.
You don't necessarily have to deal with it unless it's at your doorstep, Just like with COVID, it's like, we'll worry about it when the hospitals are overflowing, then let's start reacting,
right,
at that point.
But it's also like there aren't any visions. I'm just realizing there aren't no visions of like what happens if we're successful at battling climate change, like of the optimistic scenario. All we really hear is a pessimistic scenario of like everything, the disaster that will happen if we continue doing the thing, but never like, here is this like version in which we all actually live in a carbon zero future and we can live happily and successfully and sustainably and all that. I mean, I feel like those things are much more limited. Compare that to like economic development, in which there's almost never the negative scenario being like pushed out there. It's only the positive scenario, right? It's like this future in which we like it looks like Singapore, India looks like Singapore, or whatever. We have all these like stories of what it can be. Like that's why it's such a powerful narrative in so many countries. There is a real vision of what.
And I want to vote for things that's going to make me feel good.
Yeah.
Even if it's not guaranteed. I mean,
everybody wants development, even if it doesn't mean, like, nobody knows what it exactly means, but everybody wants it. Yeah.
Because also, because of modern technology, social media, internet, even if I come from the poorest, farming village in India, as long as I have some internet access, right, where I could watch, say, Western TV shows, and I could say, hey, why are these people driving these, SUVs and living in these big houses and, they have food delivered to their
Mm.
houses, and it's sort of, and that sort of is an infection of the mind to some extent, right? Even planting this idea, okay, this is what development could mean to me, essentially,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
And while, I mean, if you were sort of like, an illiterate, peasant, and you're not at all connected to global economy, you're not going to desire it because because you don't know what it is, right? You're going to desire this, Western lifestyle, um, and um, so, that's certainly one of the dilemmas. But then it's you cannot unwatch a movie once you've seen it, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, right. So and yeah, we're going to expose people to development to some extent. I mean, even if you go and start your field work, I mean, yeah, I must assume like the the villages you will work with, I mean, they'll ask you questions about life
Oh
in
yeah,
America,
the
right?
people love to ask about that. Yeah, I mean it's like, everyone. It's not like everyone has TV and like some internet and everything. It's like it's not like they've never seen, but it's like sometimes it's like they haven't been able to talk to that many people who have lived in America. So people love asking about life and like things like, do you get like how do you get hot water? And I'm like, oh, you just turn on the tap and it's there. That's a big deal, right? And like, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah. So let's hope it. Um, we really have to hope for the best future to on this planet, and I mean earlier I was dissing religion, but maybe now I should.
Find God.
Exactly, I should find salvation to some extent.
I mean,
And
that is a source of like optimism, and the other like the other thing that where I'm like, okay, it gives me some sense of optimism is, it's not. I don't think it's the planet that's really like I don't know. We should not continue on this podcast discussion about this, but uh, sometimes I think, okay, maybe humanity will really fuck this up and all that, but the Earth is actually, life will still go on in the long scheme of things. The Earth can actually, even if there's a total disaster, I think the Earth will be able to recapture that carbon over like millions of years and literally put it into the
yeah,
ground.
right. I mean,
And like new life will
it's metaphorical speech.
Yeah, yeah.
I think if people say we have to save the planet, I, I think everybody kind of means
It's like our
save
planet
humans.
right now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
save
yeah,
humans.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but you say, well, it's yeah, maybe in our minds it makes us feel a little bit better. I mean, if we said, because it sounds more altruistic if you said save the planet rather than save the humans, right?
Yeah, I mean it does also mean not just humans, right? Because it's like climate change will also be. I mean, it has already been very violent to a lot of animals and other species and everything. But yeah, yeah. But it's like it's not. But it doesn't. What it doesn't mean is save life in the broad sense, life on Earth. I think life on the broad sense on Earth will.
Well, the bacteria is gonna still be
And that's
there.
all
I
you
mean,
need.
yeah.
Actually, it will like let's say even if all of humanity dies, you know, because let's say if all of civilization collapses, even if some people survive, how long are they going to really continue surviving? What's the point of being like the last 100 people alive on Earth, right?
But
And-
if you still have some humans alive, and assuming that you have like, I don't know, one central computer disk where you stored science, technology, everything
yeah,
that we invented
Yeah.
in it. I'm sure you're able to do successful
you could do
reconstruction.
something, yeah.
Yeah.
Or you could like, the whole thing like with the dinosaurs, it all reset everything after that, and like life had to reemerge completely, right? So I don't know, maybe I mean I think even then like life could be repopulated and the whole cycle could like restart and everything like that. And yeah, it would just be, but it would not be a human-centric world anymore. It would, it would, who knows what will happen then. But
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I would say over the short term, I mean, people like Greta,
yeah,
they won't let us, dwell in this potential non-human future.
that's true.
I think there's a reason why we keep it to our science fiction writers, because it's so from an evolutionary biology perspective, I would say the most fundamental principle of life is the will to live, right?
Uh-huh.
It's like the idea that, okay, well, we as individuals die off, but presumably the genes that get put in next generation is going to, keep the race forward. But then, for any people who, for instance, already have children and they say, oh, sending them into climate disaster, I mean, that's going to make everything different. So my thought was that the millennial generation, which is, yours and mine, is perhaps the first one that rejects the idea of reproduction.
Right.
Well, not all of us, obviously, but a significant minority is rejecting reproduction based on, the, I don't know, imagined pessimistic climate
Right.
future.
We have lost the will to live.
That's the ultimate form of pessimism. And now you could say there's the optimists are going to say, hey, well, what if we develop the medicine that's going to stop aging, and then maybe we can push the life expectancy up by a couple of decades.
But you need to have the will to live to do that, and it's like, and I think that's where, I mean, that black sheep candidate for stopping climate change is enough new generations successfully lose the will to live, and we just, the reproduction rate of humanity dramatically goes down. Problem solved.
The problem would be solved. Yeah, I think. I mean, that sounds very appealing, and perhaps among the, subgroup within the Western populations, I think, or in East Asia, I think might be possible. But we still have some very dynamically growing countries. I mean,
Yeah.
So Sub-Saharan Africa mainly, Middle East. So, the sort of, subverting the Malthusian trap. I think it could happen, but it will probably be too late for, I don't know, the kind of climate relevant solutions, right?
Yeah, no, I wonder. I'm really curious. Yeah, what will this all?
Okay, I will ask
like,
you one
what-
last question, then
Okay.
we'll stop. Which is, which is really about. Let's draw the most optimistic future for humanity, because I mean, you see, that's always one of the things about every social science talk. I mean, specifically in sociology, because we always love studying problems. We love studying things that's fucked up and that's wrong with the world, etc. But I guess going back to the point, like realistic utopias by the late Eric Olin Wright, right? And he said basic income is part of it, of a realistic utopia. He said that peer-to-peer economy is kind of like a Wikipedia kind of economic model is going to be part of that realistic utopia. But do you have something similar in mind?
Well, the one thing that I think that I found the most moving, one vision is you read that book Ministry of the Future.
No, I.
Oh, okay, you should. Good, and it's that's why I forgot the name of it, but it was very big. Came out during the pandemic. It was quite popular. But it's I'll lend it to you, and it's about this UN Ministry of the Future, and it's like they're tasked with basically stopping environmental damage and happens. They were created after this massive heat wave in India, which kills like millions of people, right? And India decides to respond by taking these very risky like atmosphere changing like technology to like reduce the overall climate temperature. But so there's this future in which they basically like these technologies that do exist, green technologies are successfully implemented, like the actual like it's this vision which like redistribution actually genuinely occurs widely properly enough, like the people who are really trying to like stop the real like fossil fuels, the polluting industries, or the sort of entrenched elite actually lose their grip on power. But it's like all these different things have to happen. But it's like, yeah, it's like it's this vision in which land is like we're given back to nature, and nature is allowed to actually grow again.
And we only produce as much as we really need.
Yeah, right. And it's like we are there is like some kind of growth stops becoming the obsession, right?
It's like existence, living.
It's about existence, living.
Loving.
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
The
But it's
nice things.
right. And it's also in which because I think when growth stops being the obsession, then I think the nature of work fundamentally changes. You can go back to what Marx was talking about of producing only what you need and only what.
Well, he said
before.
be herding, criticizing, and fishing without being a herdsman,
Yeah.
a fisherman, or a critic.
Right. Yeah.
Basically, do the tasks that you want to do whenever you feel like.
Yeah.
And not worry about optimizing, and maximizing income, and, maximizing CV and whatever. All these
And I think for that to be possible, you have to have social equality. We can't have mass social inequality and also have, climate equality. I think a sustainable future, does like can't have excessive accumulation by a small group of people. That nothing about that is sustainable, I think.
Sustainability, equality, and end to growth.
Yeah.
So that's the optimistic vision. And
that's the optimistic vision.
So with that, I thank Vivek for being here. And,
thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
I thank all the listeners out there, and hope to see you again.